1, 2, 500, 502, 502, 503, 1.
My name is Srđan MAJSTOROVIĆ. I'm chairman of the governing board of the European Policy Center in Belgrade, and I was kindly invited to moderate this distinguished panel. Ladies and gentlemen, 2018 was welcomed as a window of opportunity for reinventing the EU through the internal reforms. In a time of contested visions within Europe and persisting challenges the EU has been facing over the recent years, a united approach and a new common vision based on a consensus and solidarity of EU member states is needed more than ever. Nevertheless, inward-looking politics, self-interests, and lack of efficiency continue to shake the European structures. The challenges of migration seems to be here to stay. Populist discourse is blending into the mainstream, while progress in Brexit withdrawal deal is lagging behind, and growing uncertainty in transatlantic relations urges shift among the EU member states to act more united and find strategic way to deal with the new normality with regards to transatlantic relationships. 2019 is going to be yet another important year for EU and Europe. Expecting the UK to leave the EU by the end of March, the EU needs to develop the new vision of the EU 27. An agreement on the new multi-annual financial framework should be reached as well during 2019. By the end of March, possible extraordinary European Council should take place and take first decisions on the future of Europe in Sibiu in Romania. Finally, European Parliament elections will take place in May, and the new President of Council and the Commission are to be elected in its aftermath. Meanwhile, the world is not going to sit down and wait. Europe is facing a series of challenges ranging from both internal and external security and international trade to environmental, energy security and migration issues. In this complicated environment, obviously Western Balkan countries are particularly interested in the future of Europe. It is obvious that Western Balkan countries are going to join a different union than the one we know today. Its new structure, its set of rules are going to shape all the EU Europeanization efforts and reforms in our Balkan societies. Thus, I would like to conclude this short introduction by claiming the right of the Western Balkan countries to be part of a dialogue on the future of Europe, and by thanking Belgrade Security Forum for making this debate possible. Here with us to discuss this important issue of the future of the Union and how to reinventing, we have a very distinguished guests and panelists. On my right-hand side, we have Ms. Emmanuela Del Rey, who is Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and Regions. She's also founder of EPOS, an international mediating and negotiating operational agency committee in Brussels. He was a director of the EU Common Foreign and Security Policy Department in Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs and head of political section of Czech NATO delegation in Brussels. To his right, we have Guillaume KLOSSA, freshly appointed as an advisor to a deputy president of the European Commission. Congratulations for that latest addition to your impressive CV. He likes to present himself as a European thinker, but he's also a former European political advisor and a business leader. He just finished his term as a director of the European Broadcasting Union. He's a president emeritus of EuropaNova, a Paris-based European think tank, and chairman of Civico EUROPA, a pro-democracy European civic movement. Guillaume was a special advisor to the minister in charge of the last French EU presidency, and before serving as Sherpa on the European Council Reflection Group on the future of the EU, chaired by President Felipe González. Together with 30 European opinion leaders, Guillaume contributed at the request of the President Juncker and Tusk to the report the European Way for the Better Future, a roadmap to relaunch Europe. On his right-hand side, I would like to welcome Ms. Nadiia KOVAL. She's the head of a Center for International Studies at the Diplomatic Academy of Ukraine. She conducted research on comparative international reconciliation issues at the National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilizations in Paris. She's also a co-founder and a board member of the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism, which prepares comprehensive annual reviews of Ukrainian foreign policy. Last but not least, at the far right from my side, but not reflecting his political affiliation, is a dear friend and colleague, Professor Florian BIEBER, who is a professor at the Southeast European History and Politics and director of the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Gratz. He's a fellow and coordinator of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group. He has worked for the European Center for Minority Issues and taught at the Kent University. He's also a visiting professor at the Nationalism Studies program at Central European University. He has been a visiting fellow at the LSE and the New York University. His research interest includes democratization, institutional design in multi-ethnic states, nationalism, and ethnic conflict resolution. He's also an author of numerous publications, especially dedicated to this region. So as you see, we have an extremely distinguished group of panelists, and I would like to start this discussion on how to reinvent the EU with a common question to all of you, and to start by saying, by starting from the ground, what is EU today for you personally, for your country, for the institution that you are representing, and then we will engage in a dialogue how to move on in reinventing the new Europe. Ms. Del Rey, the floor is yours.
This is a difficult question because you put the accent on a personal experience as well, which means that Europe is not just a common project, but it's also something that we have internalized as Europeans over the years. I was born when the European Union was already in place, and for me it's a natural asset of my personality, being a European. And when I say European, I mean the word in a very wide sense, including the Balkans, including this region, for instance, which has always been a reference point for the European Union in general, for a number of reasons. I mean, it would be banal just to reduce it to the historical links and to the cultural bonds and the common understanding. So, personally speaking, Europe for me is part of my being and my identity. Nowadays, we are going through a difficult phase of introspection, which I don't think is only a moment of negativity, but I think it's also a very positive moment, because after years in which the European Union has been built upon, obviously, certain common values, certain goals, trying to, as Robert Schuman said in 1950, to create a de facto solidarity. This is the moment in which the European Union is really going through a phase of introspection, as I said, to develop a different way of interpreting the concept of European Union. The principles are usually on which the European Union is based are, unity in diversity, which is something that we have kept in mind very strongly in the last decades in which the European Union has slowly developed, because diversity has been one of the elements on which the European Union has concentrated the most at social level, while it was instead concentrating very much on unity at institutional level, financial level, and other levels related to the more organized and structural construction of the idea. So the problem is that nowadays we find on one hand populations that strive to keep their own identity very strongly, because there hasn't been, in my view, a strong engagement in creating a proper European social cohesion. And on the other hand, we have a strong centralized concept of origination of legislations, measures, and ideas. So these two are now conflicting, and I think despite the fact that this is causing a certain crisis, this is an opportunity for change. Just to tell you one word about the concept of internalization that I mean when I say that we should resolve the problem of introspection and the process of introspection with an internalization of the concept of the European Union. I mean that in the last few decades, very little has been done to listen to the real requests and demands of the population. There has been a huge distance between, let's say, the institutions in Brussels and the reality on field in every single place we have in Europe. Europe is a fantastic place where we have a strong localization, but this has been, let's say, probably underestimated as a social and political power. And therefore, in this sense, probably the European Union is now facing a crisis. Obviously, we have a multi-level governance that has emerged as the most essential feature of the institutional system of the European Union. But what does this mean? Definitely, it's not a question of a Europe of nations. It's not it's not a question of a European superstate. It's not a question of European of regions. What kind of Europe are we talking about? These dimensions, the different dimensions, are interconnected. They are obviously coordinated. There is an institutional will, obviously, to overcome the separations. But at the same time, obviously, we have to find a balance between these actions, especially at political level, the demands of the populations, the needs of the populations in terms of understanding what the processes are about, and obviously the common goal, which is unity in the line with what has been said earlier on, the fact that we have had peace and stability and prosperous societies for such a long time. Obviously, what I say is that we have to concentrate very much on this new attitude, which is described by, in a derogatory way, in a denigrating way, as populism. And I think that in this sense, populism is an asset, is an opportunity, because it gives back to populations that have not been listened to the dignity they deserve. And this includes also, obviously, the region of the Western Balkans.
Thank you. David, what is Europe for someone who comes from a Czech Republic and who has dedicated his career working for your foreign service?
Good, Srđan, thank you very much. I also did my PhD in international politics and NATO. If you look at the immediate multilateral union, I mean, this is very broad, legalistic, legal framework, which I think does not have any flaw. So we are rediscovering what this framework allows us, and more importantly, what we should do in the concrete political ways. This strategic pause I am speaking about is not connected to the doubts about the vision, what the Europe should be. I think the vision is clear. It was set in Rome last year in very generic terms: safe and secure, prosperous and sustainable, social, stronger on global scene. These are 4 areas where there is large agreement. But I think where are we now is, what does it mean for the concrete actions? From which direction will we take to fill it with the substance? And I think it will take us the next institutional cycle, once the new institutions are online and once the multi-year budget is agreed, to tell us what's the future path of the European integration. I will leave it with that.
Thank you very much. Guillaume, you have a very particular experience of being in the room where certain decisions on the future of Europe were deliberated. What is Europe today for you personally? How do you see it evolving?
Well, first of all, I think we don't need to see Europe as something static, because if you think from the beginning, it's a continuous process. And in fact, it's a continuous reforming process, and we constantly adapt to new reality. And we are in a period where we are in a radical shift, which is a global radical shift, where all the traditional paradigm disappeared. Exactly the same kind of period we had during the European Renaissance, where suddenly you have two global power emerging, rebalancing the global order. You have an information revolution, you have an industrial revolution, and you have an existential question about the place of God, the place of man in society. And we are exactly in this period. And the question for us is, do we want the statu quo, or are we going to take advantage of this new global order to, I don't know if it's reinvent, rediscover ourselves, maybe rediscover ourselves, to be relevant in globalization? And the question is, we have a certain number of challenges which are transnational: migration, security, artificial intelligence, stability, etc. How do we want to cope with them? Do we want to go by our side, or do we want to go together? And where do we want to go? And the other issue is how. Because initially the European construction was something made by very clever, very smart people, but without citizens. And in this period, what we see is European citizens want to be part of the European shaping. And they don't want to be, they don't want only to delegate to head of state and government this future. And they don't want to think into silo, which is very important, because you have a series of national silos, and citizens don't want to see the EU as another way of making the war between national interests. They want something more, which is a European general interest. So we are in this wonderful period where we have an opportunity to define together our future. Just a word regarding populism. Populism is not something specific to Europe or nationalism. It is something you find everywhere in the world, because in this period of global rebalance, everybody has a question of identity. The Brazilian, the American, even the Chinese, the Russian, etc. So do not focus as being a specific, this being a specificity. It is just the normality of the period in which we are, where many questions are posed to everybody. And when you have that in mind, the question is how to define or to go on defining a collective project. Let me say a word about my vision of Europe and the methodology, and maybe a word about Serbia. If I think about our future, Serbia and the Balkan will have a key role, because you can't have, let's say, Europe can't go well if the Balkans don't go well. Let's be very clear. Europe can't go well if the Balkans can't go well. So it means that this country, Serbia, has a specific role for the future of Europe. That's very clear for me, because it's a country which has a leadership role in terms of democracy, in terms of stability in the region and ahead, because Serbia is one of the only countries outside the EU supporting EU effort in Africa, for example. And in addition to that, this country has a specific role in culture and European identity, and a role of bridges between the EU and Russia. So we are in a period where the question is not what the EU give me and how I take advantage of it. It's not the question of just being a member of the EU. It's a question of both sides. How can the EU contribute to my development, to develop a sustainable society, and how can I contribute to the development of the EU? That is the philosophy of the EU. It's not only a matter of rules, it's a matter of commitment. It's a matter of being together. It's a matter of reinventing us together. I am French. I am a French citizen. I am a European citizen. And they go together. My French citizenship reinforces my European citizenship, and my European citizenship reinforces my French citizenship. So that I am sovereign in a world which is not anymore a Western world. That's for me a key issue. And the other issue is the methodology, the real methodology. Can we go on building the European Union without the citizen? Finally, when you think about the Brexit, there was 3 issues. One issue was a kind of democratic crisis, and the way of doing Europe does not work anymore. So we need to include citizens, and we need to understand in which step of democracy we are, because democracy is something which evolves continuously. And we are in a period where representative democracy needs to be complemented by deliberative and participative democracy. And for me, one of the key challenges of Europe is inventing this complementarity model. If we don't do it, we are not going to be relevant for the future, and we are not going to be able to remain an inspirational force. And Europe was, and is for me, a source of inspiration for the world. If we are not that, we are losing our DNA. And the methodology also is a co-construction methodology. As the Australian president said, we need to co-shape together the future. We have that specific responsibility, and this responsibility is a question for head of state and government, is a question for member of parliament, it's a question for civil society, and it's a question for citizens.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. You mentioned Europe as a source of inspiration. What is the view from Ukraine, a country that perhaps at this moment does not have a European membership perspective, but it's very dedicated to its Europeanization, if you wish. How do you perceive Europe today, and how do you perceive its future and its influence on developments in your region?
Oh, thank you very much. Obviously, compared to our colleagues' perspectives, who are much more practical in this regard because they are already members of the European Union, Ukrainians normally have much more romantic vision of Europe. They have the European values are still very, very attractive. We still place European flags alongside national flags because it still is very attractive, and not only in this romantic vision, but also as a very clear strategic choice. Ukraine has made actually its decision to make this European integration its basic security goal, the basis, even if I may say, of survival of the country. And we have paid a very high price for this choice up to now, and we continue fighting. We have some territories occupied, we have thousands of people dead, we have went through incredible destruction because still there are some countries on this continent that consider that they can be veto players to decide what their neighbors can do or what they cannot do in the realm of their foreign policy. And of course it has big impact for us, first of all, in the terms of war that is waging currently, and secondly, it has an impact on the attitude of some European Union states, which became more and more cautious as to cooperation with Ukraine, or how should we build this cooperation. It poses pretty much questions. And the current problem for Ukraine is a certain paradox, because from the one side, we have the most successful period in our relations with the European Union. Just in the few last years, we have finally concluded, ratified, and went into force with a very, very comprehensive association agreement. We have this free trade area functioning, and what is really very important for the people from the country that spent decades behind the Iron Curtain, and then spent another few decades with quite important visa restrictions just to be able to travel and to see, to communicate with their European colleagues. To have this freedom of movement is very, very important thing. And here, when we take this really difficult strategic situation of this enlargement fatigue, reinventing the Union, armed conflict, what's important for Ukraine, probably in my view, is first concentrate, take a kind of advantage of the strategic pause, like our Czech colleague has said, because like association agreement is a huge deal of work for 10 years or more to align Ukrainian laws and regulations to the acquis communautaire and stuff. But the second and not less important thing is to follow actually the debate on the future of the European Union. And me personally, I follow this debate, and I even drafted some papers about how the European Union could look in the future. And to invent together how can we proceed in our common European future. Ukraine, Eastern Partnership countries, and other neighborhood countries who are interested in that, because sadly we are very, very often not present in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Florian, I would ask you to be a representative of the Balkans. You're coming from Austria, which some would consider a part of the region, if not geographically. Your president said that Western Balkans countries should be part of a debate on the future of Europe. How do you see Europe today and its influence on the Western Balkans? Is it, as our colleague Ivan Krastev said, is it too big to fail, or is it too perfect to succeed, to ask for the respect of these values which are being embedded in the basis of the EU integration process?
Thanks, Srđan, for the question, but maybe I start on a more personal note regarding of how I see myself in Europe, or in a certain way, coming from Luxembourg originally, and there I say, I start basically saying I belong to the 2%, not the 2 richest percent of Europe, but the 2% of European citizens who identify primarily as Europeans, or as Europeans rather than as also national citizens or as other ones. And if you think about it, 2% of Europeans say that they are primarily Europeans. It sounds like a small number, but that's the same number as there are Czechs, Greeks, and 16 other nationalities or citizens in the European Union. So there's a very large number of people who identify as Europeans. And in fact, if we look at all the other indicators in Europe, the crisis of Europe is not a crisis of confidence of citizens. We have to, in a certain way, challenge this narrative. We're all buying into the populists' narrative that people don't like Europe. In fact, the confidence in Europe is at a peak for 20 years, like at the highest point in 20 years. Trust in institutions is high. The number of people who identify either as primarily or, as Guillaume said, citizen of France and citizen of the European Union is at a high point, not at a low point. The idea of Europe is popular. The idea that you're better off outside of the European Union is only one country thinks there's a slight majority in favor of that, according to the last Eurobarometer, and that country is the United Kingdom. In every other country, a clear majority of citizens believe that they're better off in the Union than outside of the European Union. What do people think is the biggest achievement of Europe? It's freedom of movement. So this is the irony, where we're surrounded by populist messages and others who believe this talk that people don't like freedom of movement. This is what people actually value in Europe. So what we're dealing with is a crisis of confidence in a project which is actually vastly popular and which has gained popularity in the last 6-7 years. It hasn't dropped. So we have a paradox where we have parties which claim loudly that Europe is doomed and that we need more nation states and close borders and all of that. But this is not the reflection of the silent majority as these parties want to tell us. They always say, we speak in the name of the people. They lie. They don't speak in the name of the people. They speak in the name of some people. And they are there, and they're more articulate in terms of being more visible than they were 15 years ago. This is what Guillaume said about the fact that Europe was excluding citizens' voices. But we should be more confident in including those voices because the vast majority of citizens actually want Europe. And the others who don't, we have to convince them, we have to talk to them. But we shouldn't assume that those parties who claim to speak in the name of a silent majority actually do so. So it's a crisis of elites, it's a crisis of the system, but it's also a crisis of democracy in Europe, where the system is more polarized. If we look at, my country of citizenship had elections a few days ago. There are 6-7 political parties. No single party has above 30%. This is the new normal. This is the European normal where you have a far right, maybe a far left. You have multiple parties. We have to live with this reality of mass-based politics not being the reality. But how does the Balkans fit into this equation? And I think, coming to your question, Srđan, is very much, we have to not just think of Europe with the Balkans have to think, and the citizens of being in Europe. And I think one of the problems we see is that a lot of the discussion about joining Europe is this, first of all, still believe that there's a deus ex machina which will come and solve all the problems. People will leave the Balkans for Europe as they have done in hundreds of thousands in recent years, and the EU doesn't change it. In fact, many EU countries are happy about it. Nobody says that there have been more citizens of the Balkans, EU and non-EU member states, going to Germany in the last 4 years than from Syria and Afghanistan combined. Nobody talks about that very much, because that actually is not a problem in terms of public discourse. So the EU will not solve the problems of the Balkans. It will not, it can help, but it's this, I mean, and then there's this other element which is linked to that, is that there used to be this saying in the Ottoman Empire about alla franga, like a franc, and it was a derogatory term of people who copied Western fashions, dressed like Westerners, copied Western ideas. But it was considered to be a derogatory because it was seen as insincere, it was seen as superficial. And there's still, and especially when it comes to elites and when it comes to the way in which EU integration is understood, this kind of alla franga. This, we copy the fashion, but we don't believe in it. And so what has to change fundamentally is thinking as being part of the European Union and not as copying what it means. And if there's nobody offering you something to copy, then you have nothing to do. You know, if we don't have 2025 to join the European Union, what shall we do? We'll just lean back and wait for a new date to come. No, in a certain way, you can join the European project today if you want to, but when I hear the president of this country or of other governments of other countries, I always feel it's if they really want us, maybe we'll do something. Well, that's not what Europe is about and what thinking about being part of Europe is about. And I think that's where there has to be a switch. There has to be a switch in Europe to regain confidence in the project, and there has to be a switch in the region to think about being part of Europe means not waiting for the next law to download, but thinking about the norms and the systemic nature of the country, what it should look like for the benefit of the citizens, and that Europe is the framework within doing it.
Thank you. I really appreciate what you said, that this is a crisis of confidence in a project that is eventually popular among the citizens. Madam Del Rey, the rise of different sorts of populist movements across Europe is showing signs of a mistrust, as Florian said, vis-à-vis traditional political parties, not perhaps vis-à-vis Europe itself. Is it a sign that somehow we fail to explain how EU membership is affecting citizens' lives? What is the, or is it a sign of simple alienation of the Brussels, under quotation, bureaucracy that fails to communicate the same message to the citizens?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that we have a major problem in Europe at the moment, and I find it very much related to communication. I think that the way we are approaching the issue of the so-called populism at the moment is really very badly described, not analyzed, and it's the fruit of, let's say, some sort of political manipulation rather than a concrete reflection on the particular issue. I'm talking now not only as a member of the parliament, and I'm actually a member of the government because I'm a Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, but this is a very new experience for me. I'm also talking as a scholar because I think that analysis and reality and trying to fight the so-called fake news is very much an important responsibility at the moment, especially as regards these new political movements such as, you know, the so-called populist movements that have very different features, very different characteristics, and especially not all have negative characteristics and effects. So this is one question that I think we should analyze, and maybe next year the Belgrade Security Forum could concentrate on this, because This is the issue of the future. What is populism? Why do we have this part of the political world that was very institutionalized, quite traditional, very rhetoric in its way of expressing itself, and now instantly something changed so much that the way of describing politics, the way of identifying the main actors within the political system has completely changed. This is something very important. I agree with Florian when he says, you know, Europeans are pro-Europe. In Italy, for instance, I say, I mean, Italy is absolutely pro-Europe. I mean, I don't know anyone who would be happy coming out of the European Union. I think it's a common feeling. Yet, there is, as I said at the beginning, a strong introspection is a moment in which these populist, so-called populist movements are helping the process of understanding what is going on, what the perspectives are, what the issues are, what kind of challenges, and how and what kind of methodology could be developed now with the new features of the European Union, with the new situation, with new emerging issues such as migration that has become a real test bed for all the different approaches, national approaches, and also obviously at European institutional level to understand what the reality is in terms of ability to react, ability to produce policies, ability to give proper responses. So this is, I think, something we should reflect upon. As you were saying at the beginning, populism is a fact. But populism, as I said to you, for instance, in Italy, with the movement 5 Star, which I gladly accepted to join when they offered me to be part of the adventure, which I find very interesting, is, for instance, a way of channeling, you know, all the uneasiness of the citizens, not only, also of giving an answer to all the questions that were asked and never got an answer from previous politicians, unfortunately, and also the distance between the very far elites in not only in the government of Italy, but also in the European Union, which is perceived quite distant, not only geographically, but also ideally and psychologically as well. And this instead is a way of going more, near the population. It's a proxy politics. It's a politics of understanding, giving also a sense of, let's say, priority to what every single individual is expressing. In Italy in particular, we don't have extreme right. You know, we don't have Nazi movements, we don't have real, extreme right episodes, because this, this uneasiness of the population has been channeled in ways by which people find a way of expressing themselves. And I think that this is extraordinary. I think this is a very interesting experiment. I think it's becoming very valuable also because this particular part, especially the movement 5 Star, obtained 33% of the votes in the last elections, and you know that Italians always vote very much. We have always a huge turnout of the elections, and also they vote with a lot of awareness of the situation. So 33% of the population is made of all sorts of social classes, all sorts of level of education. It's a mixed group of people who believe in a new adventure. I think we shouldn't underestimate this, and I think that the European Union, because it is called to understand this new phenomena, I think the European Union must take into account this new way of interpreting politics and should take into account the fact that this could be an added value, because it's a new way of, let's say, allowing the population to be more participating more in the process, and in this way allowing social cohesion to become more concrete, and also, as I said at the beginning, making the so-called de facto solidarity based only on treaties and agreements and so on into a real internalized solidarity, which is part of a system of the European values which become concrete according to specific issues, such as migration. But I guess we will approach migration in the next round. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David, one of the issues which is going to be in the scope of, in the focus of debate on the future of Europe is to how to answer the security challenges in the future. Hybrid wars, influence through social media, terrorism, radicalization. These are all issues which needs to be addressed in order to make sure that citizens feel safe. The rise of a far-right movements is basically sometimes predominantly caused by the campaigns of fear. What is your expectations? How the EU security policy is going to develop? What is the future of the relationship between the EU and NATO? Recently we heard some NATO members being reluctant to help some others if they were threatened by outside forces. How is this going to work in the future?
Yeah, thank you. That's a $1 million question. What's happening now in the European Union? There is absolute recognition of the importance of the security for the prosperity of the concept, or even the future of for the concept. That's first. Second, there is the deep recognition that the original distinction between internal and external security and the ways how we handle these two things is basically gone. You know, this clear line which you could draw at the border has basically disappeared conceptually. We are developing the instruments which should help us to address this totality. It's called internal-external security nexus. And it's also true that not all the challenges we have outside will necessarily project itself into the inside of the European Union and vice versa. But at certain points, like if you have the regional instabilities, failed states, we have seen that there could be almost immediate influence which will manifest themselves in our countries, even in our capitals. Look at the terrorist attacks which have been inspired or even trained and equipped from the outside. So that's first. This conceptual thinking is now deeply rooted in what's happening now in the European Union. For the countries like mine, which is both member of the EU and NATO, if we speak about the security and defense, we tend to speak about Europe. So we don't necessarily say that when we are developing something in the European Union, this is for the European Union as such, and vice versa in NATO. For us, it's Europe. It's the European capability. The baseline of it is, in defense, there is no EU army and there is no NATO army. There is just national army, which basically provides the capability to the EU or to the NATO. So for us, whatever happens in the European Union must reinforce NATO, and I would say vice versa. There is no challenge to NATO in the current EU project. And when I sometimes have the talk with the partners, they are sometimes nervous about what's happening in the European Union and whether it will, for example, sip off some capabilities to the EU, which will not be then available to the NATO. And I tell them, always look for 3 parameters in what's happening in the EU. The first of them is this based on the planning of collective defense. That's a very specific thing which is going on in NATO, and it's not present in EU at all, and there is not even a sign that it will be present in the foreseeable future. So the EU as such is not able to define what it needs for its own territorial defense, and I think that's correct because that's done in NATO, so it's not present in the EU. The second thing is whether anything which is being developed in the EU is earmarked as the EU only, basically giving it the exclusivity for the EU. Again, in the area of defense, it's not there. Simply, it's not there. And the third thing is whether these things are nationally owned. That's, as I said, there are no EU army and there is no NATO army, and again, this thing is not present in the EU. There is a lot going on in the EU right now. which is connected to what I said at the beginning about this framework, which is basically designed well, and we are using what the framework allows us, and that's the PESCO, for example. The PESCO, which is permanent enhanced cooperation, which is the project which is now ongoing. It has certain start. There are almost all EU nations. There have been different concepts around it. It's still not really alive and kicking, but it's something which ultimately should help us. So that's first. Second, there is the recognition that we need to have the capability to equip our armed forces with the critical technologies. So that's connected to the European industry. And again, there are many conceptual answers which have not been answered, but there is definitely this link. And the third, and that is I think the most important for me, is the recognition that you cannot solve the challenges of today by armed force. It must be part of the solution, but it's not the solution. So there must be a lot of other instruments built around in pre-conflict, conflict, post-conflict phase, which you use to have basically the successful outcome. And again, I think these things are being present and are being developed and are being present in the proposal for the multi-annual framework. Last word on the NATO-EU cooperation. I still remember the days where the so-called Brussels Agreement was done between NATO and the EU. It was, of course, still the Cyprus entered the European Union, which then changed the whole possibilities for the cooperation between NATO and EU. And I remember it was quite painful searching what should we do together and how we will work together. And it was clear, and I have also witnessed it inside the countries, inside the organizations EU and NATO, that there are even the different organizational cultures, how you discuss things, on which you focus, and so. And then there was kind of, again, as I said in the EU, there was also kind of strategic pause between the EU and NATO, but now I think this thing changed. There are still the limitations, but there is definitely the will to try to work as much as we can together, and especially in the areas which you mentioned, in the areas of hybrid, in the areas of military mobility, in the areas of stabilizing our neighborhood, cooperating. So this cooperation is basically not a hard security cooperation in a way that we are going together to send our forces, but the recognition that the world around us needs constant attention by different instruments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We heard concerns even by President Vučić here about the peace and stability in the region. And if you read the Serbian tabloid newspapers, you will see that the war is all over the front pages. So obviously there is a necessity, I would say, to have a closer cooperation between the Western Balkan countries and the EU and the NATO member states in the area of security, because security of Europe basically depends on the security of this region. But I would dare to say that this security lies far more embedded into the security of democratically functioning societies and institutions, rather than being afraid of all-out scale war breaking out in the region. But coming back to you, Guillaume, speaking about reinventing the Europe, and coming back to what Ms. Del Rey said, it is obvious that there needs to be a channel and mechanisms to include the public into the debate on the future of Europe. I think Ms. Del Rey rightfully pointed out that sometimes what we consider perhaps oversimplistically as populism is perhaps a good detection of certain parts of society that felt excluded from the politics. How to include societies, how to include public in a debate about Europe, which doesn't have a single public space and media services to communicate it with. You have a vast experience in this area, and I would like to ask you to share some experience with us, especially on Macron's initiative, President Macron's initiative on civil dialogue?
Several thoughts. First of all, as Florian said, European citizens, I would not say they love Europe, but they consider Europe is useful, and they consider that Europe is their future. But if you go more inside, they have several questions. And one question is, we need to have perspective. We need to have perspective and to have positive perspective for the future. And we believe that our future will not be better and that the future of our children will not be better. And the question is how to build positive perspective. And they don't want this perspective to be decided by diplomats, head of state or government, but they want to have the control. And if there is a clear signal from what you call the nationalist party, etc., is the idea to have the control back and to be in responsibility for the citizen to design the future. This is a clear thing. But if you have the control back, and if you want to drive the future of the EU and also the future at your national level, you need to have some common basis. How can you think ourselves, European, without a minimum of civic education? If we don't have a minimum of joint civic education, we can't feel ourselves and project ourselves in a positive perspective. And maybe Emmanuela, Claudia could launch that at the level of the Italian government and make it a positive proposal for the EU. Because otherwise, you make Europe without citizens, because citizens have not a joint basis. So they say, but this is bullshit. Sorry to say that, I don't want to be... But this is bullshit. You need to have a clear understanding of the common values, of the democratic process, which are not so complex, so much complex as many people said. It's not true. We are in a complex society, so we need to have institutions which are in phase with this complex society. This is very important. One thing. The second thing is you need to have a minimum of common public space. Because otherwise, you can't project yourself. Democracy is a matter of choosing people, is a matter of deciding with regard to the budget, is a matter of control. And we have one difficulty, is European citizens consider Europe as a democratic model. And of course, it's not the classical democratic model, but they consider as it was the classical democratic model. And as long as we do not define a public space, there will be a gap and there will be a deception and a disappointment with regard to what the EU is. Regarding my previous experience as a director of the European Broadcasting Union, of which all your countries are part, we organized the last Spitzen candidate, the candidate running for the presidency of the EU debate, at the request of the European political group, of all the European political group. And the question was the following. If you want to give legitimacy to the European institution, you need to choose the people who lead the European Commission. And what we saw, very interesting, I don't know if you remember, but the Barroso Commission, the Prodi Commission, as early as Prodi or Barroso was appointed, there was a call for illegitimacy, saying they are not legitimate because they are not appointed by the people. Regarding the Juncker Commission, you had never that claim. You can say the Commission is not working well, or there are certain behavior, but there is not a claim with regard to the democratic legitimacy of the European Commission. It's something very new. It's something that's very new, and it should be understood as a clear signal that democracy is a matter of small signal associating people. Coming back now to the idea of citizen consultation that President Macron led, or initiated, I think it's a good idea. People need to be consulted. They need to be part of the process. But it's a first step. They need to be part of the process at national level. But what they want to be exactly, they want to think together. They don't want to say, okay, the French are doing their job of what they want with regard to Europe, the Germans are doing, the Greeks are doing, etc. And everybody is going to ask things which are different and to propose reform of the EU which are different. And then you can't reform. You can't go ahead together because you have not thought together. If you look at the qualitative result of the European barometer, what do they say finally? They say citizens are in favor of Europe, but they don't believe in a European Union, which is only the result of national silo defining the future of Europe. Because it means that finally, at the end of the day, between Serbian and Swedes, French and Greek, or German and Greek, there are little things to do together. If you mix, and we organize that with Pavel Demesh, which earlier moderated the debate, in a project which was a new Pact for Europe, which was a transnational project, we mixed German and Greek. And you know that German and Greek are very opposed. But if you have them 2 days in a room, at the end of the day they find the common perspective to go ahead. If you keep them in their national room, in their silo room, they can't go ahead. They disagree. So the real issue is we need to find a methodology to make people think together. And it's not a matter of nation against federation. It's not a matter of national power versus a European power. It's a matter of modernity. Because technology, translation technology, artificial intelligence, debate technique allow that. If we don't do it, others are going to make it for us, but maybe without a positive goal for us. So the real issue is, do we want to lead in the future of democracy, or do we consider that we abdicate democracy? Democracy is not something static. It's something that you invent continuously, really continuously. And for me, and it was also in the speech of President Macron and President Juncker 2 years ago in his speech on the State of the Union, we have an opportunity to co-shape the future, but we need creativity. And maybe Serbs will propose creative solutions for that.
Madam Del Rey, you would like to react?
Well, I just want to say that the question is not whether we want Europe or not, because we want Europe. The question is the methodology, and I agree with you on that. There are a number of issues on the table at the moment. For instance, the issue of the qualified majority, which is a very important element that is very controversial and must be analyzed very clearly, because not only obviously we need to include the population, but we also have to understand that in order to create that internalized solidarity that I talk about, and the fact that we really share a common future and we understand the responsibility of each member state in building our own common future, also because we want to include other countries like, for instance, Serbia, and therefore we have to be also solid ourselves in our way of approaching political, economic and social problems. In that sense, obviously, we have to develop a methodology. For instance, the qualified majority. On one hand, obviously, it would speed up the process, because we know very well that one of the issues in the European Union is the very long time that every process takes, and in the development of months and years, it becomes something that really loses is somehow it's a very important energetic initiative that was, you know, the, let's say, igniting element at the beginning. So this would speed up the process, but on the other hand, it would enhance divisions within the European Union. If we show that we don't reach consensus within, you know, a decisional process, we would lose the strength of our unity. So far, we have always reached consensus through unity, through the fact that we were reaching decisions that would reflect the opinion of all of us. If we do a qualified majority, it would be interesting, it would be somehow practical, but it would be, in a sense, a way of creating side problems. This is for the political issues, for the defense issues, for the economic issues, and many other elements that we are obviously putting on the table at the moment. So the issue is definitely not whether we want Europe or not. We want more Europe. We want more aware Europe, more really solidarity, more real solidarity that would reflect the will of all of us together in facing important challenges, like, for instance, migration, that, as I said before, became, you know, the major issue at the moment, because it has become, let's say, a test bed for all the countries to show their real approach to the problem and to the will of sharing the same responsibilities. I think that the fact that migration became such a problem, although, as I always say, obviously migration, in my view, is a natural aspiration of human beings, and it must be protected and allowed and only managed, in the sense that we don't want any more loss of lives and we don't want any more tragedies, but definitely it's a natural aspiration. So we are going to have migration forever, and we all in this room come from countries who have been migrating. At the same time, obviously, we need structural responses. We need responses that stay. We need especially shared responsibility. And I think that some politicians who made an appeal to a common European responsibility did well, because they also enhanced the fact that there are countries that don't want to take this responsibility, that are erecting walls, that are closing their borders. And this is an indicator of something that is not going right in the, you know, construction of the common identity of the European Union. So I think that we have to analyze carefully all the issues on the table in Europe at the moment. We cannot just, you know, accept a very vivid description of what is going on, because this is affecting the population very badly. It's feeding fear, it's feeding uncertainty, it's not responding to the real questions. And the people are able to understand the questions, and people are able to contribute.
Thank you. This is a dream of every moderator, to have an interacting dialogue between panelists. But please keep it short, because we have a structure as well.
A quick say on the migration issue, which is a key issue. But for me, I followed the migration issue the last 4 years. I think we have a difficulty, because we were always in a reacting situation with crisis. And something that I suggested to President Hollande and to Vice President Timmermans was to have a common understanding of the reality of migration, the short, medium, and long-term challenges, in order to define a short, medium, and long-term strategy. And the fact is, the answer was no, because within the member state, nobody wanted to have that analyzed, to be honest. And secondly, they wanted to show that they were reacting, they were acting. But when you act on a false basis, you disappoint, because every time there is a new problem which is coming, and you are not able to solve it, you solve the problem of the past. So if we want to solve the migration issue, I think we need to have a group which is independent from the state, like it does exist for climate. You know, you have this international expert group on climate, which is very well known, and who help member states to have a common understanding on the issue and to take decisions. If we don't do that, we are going to take decision on the migration issue without a common analysis. And this is bad politics. And I don't want we go on doing bad politics, because we don't want to have a common understanding of the reality, because for some member state or for some national political movement, it's of political short-term interest.
A word to answer, I want to say that the case of Italy, for instance, we are experts in migrations because we have been, tackling the problem since many years ago, and obviously in the last few years we have saved the lives of 100,000 people, more than any number you could ever imagine. So we know the problem very well, and this is why, probably you missed it, but I said we need structural responses. I'm not going deeply into that. Just let me finish.
We do agree, we do agree, but what I'm just saying is...
I'm just saying, I have, I am the bearer, also because I'm the Minister of International Cooperation, I'm the bearer of a methodology in this. I am promoting this new system of shared development by which we address the root causes of migration, making sure that the countries of origin develop their own sustainable, system by which they can allow the people to live happily and freely. We are donating an immense amount of money to develop specific areas in economics, in the social field, empowering women, and all the other things that you can imagine. And this concept of shared development, I think, should be interiorized by the whole European Union, because I don't think it is yet something that we consider very important. When I say shared development, I mean a development for the countries of origin that is actually decided together, with a bidirectional system in which beneficiary and donors are both equally important, and they have to participate in the process together. This has been completely absent from the mentality of the European Union so far, and this is what I'm also personally doing to change the system, because I think that migration, apart from guaranteeing protection to the people who are arriving in our countries, and this is absolutely a duty, and we have to defend human rights at any cost. Beside that, obviously, we also have to address the root causes. We don't have to react on emergency. We have to react on a long-term strategy, also obviously having to, anyway, face the everyday problems that emerge because people need help and need to be protected. So it's a proper system, it's a methodology. Obviously, we don't have enough time, and we are still in the time of the other speakers, but definitely this is something that is absolutely clear. And our government, Italian government, is working on the front line in this sense, and we really hope that we will work together with all the others, because this is the most important thing. This is where unity becomes a reality.
I was just to give you a small contribution to what you could propose in order to develop a consensus quicker, which is you can't have a consensus and you can't let the policy you want to lead if there is not a shared understanding of the challenges and the reality. And for that, it needs to be defined not by the member state, but by an independent expert group. Just to help you on what I was saying, it's not, I think what you say is fair, but if you want really to go in that direction, there is also a question of methodology. You need to have a shared basis.
Thank you for your suggestions. We will take note of this. Although, as I said to you, Italy is a leader in this field. We have a huge experience and we can share it with you. So maybe you can learn some of our methodology and we can develop new strategies together. I think that communication is always very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I said, this is a dream of any panelist to have a vivid interaction between participants. But as I said, we need to finalize in a structured way, because obviously we need some time for questions and answers from the audience. Now, Nadiia, you just witnessed a European dialogue on the future of Europe. This dialogue might go in different directions. We might end up with Fortress Europe, which is going to be closed. We might end up with Europe which is open, for welcoming for outside countries. What is going to be an impact of these different kind of solutions on romantic views that you explained at the start of this panel of Ukrainian citizens? How are they going to feel in a scenario that, I don't know, EU adopts the decision that there is no future for Ukraine in the EU and the other Eastern Partnership countries?
I hope it will never come to that, first of all.
Hypothetically.
But this exchange between the colleagues, it was very illustrative, and I would say it's very relevant because it shows like the depths of what should be overcome to imagine this European Union of the future. And we just witnessed a certain asymmetry of perception, yes, how the problem of migration is treated and how it should be treated. And probably one of the most important questions now is that there are very many of those asymmetries and different perceptions. Probably what would be closer to Ukraine's experience is would be the very different perceptions of security threats between different European states and groups of states. Yes, when we have, for example, our neighbors from Central Europe who are fully aware from the Russian military threats, and we have states from the southern for whom, for example, migrations that we have discussed or terrorism questions are too important, and they instead regard the Russian Federation as a kind of partner to have a dialogue of security instead. And while we have all these security asymmetries and also very important asymmetries of ambition, yes, from Ukraine as a country which would like to join the European Union altogether, and the European Union who would rather, at this time, aim for a less ambitious aim in our relations. I think the overall debate of the future of Europe, it shows us that some ways out of this could go into a way of some sectoral cooperation, deeper sectoral cooperation in some issues that are of mutual interest for both Ukraine and EU. And unfortunately, we all hoped very much that in the years 2017 and 2018, there will be a kind of breakthrough in the reform of the European Union, that we will come with the solutions both to the, I don't know, institutional design, to migration crisis, to the budget. Also, there was great hope to have a budget before the election, but now it's getting less and less possible. Probably what will European Union tell to Ukraine and Ukraine to European Union will be more clear after the whole electoral process, because we have this long electoral process in the European Union in 2019, and Ukraine also goes through double elections the next year. But until we are there, I think we could aim for more cooperation. For example, the very successful example, probably the exception, was this breakthrough in security. Yes, what was already mentioned, the ideas of permanent structured cooperation and other different initiatives in this regard. We could cooperate there better because, for example, permanent structural cooperation, it's also about involving some third countries and partner countries. And we could imagine some creative solutions. How can we cooperate with that, with our experience, for example, in hybrid wars fighting, for cyber security and different things. So we have very many vistas open, and probably when we are through all these elections and we have more clarity, then we'll see the strategy, the big strategy, how the European Union develops and how Ukrainians' European policy does.
Thank you. Florian, to close to finish this round of questions, what is the contribution of the Western Balkans to this discussion on the future of Europe? Is there any? Can some of the mechanisms which are part of the EU accession process of the Western Balkan countries be instrumental in developing new mechanisms within the EU, how to address those countries who are straying from the respect of the fundamental values? We've seen certain procedures, according to Article 7, being raised against one member state. What is the story of is there anything to be learned for the member states? Somehow the EU integration process in the Western Balkans is more oriented towards Western Balkans, but somehow lessons have been lost within the EU itself. This is at least the perception from the region. What is going to be the quality of the membership of the Western Balkans country if we do not respect the same set of rules?
Thanks. I mean, I think there are two related issues here at stake. The first one is that if you talk to officials in the member states, you often get the story, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of previous enlargements. That's a very kind of nearly monotonous statement. We don't want to repeat the early, presumably too early enlargement with Bulgaria and Romania, and we want to avoid the crisis of rule of law of Poland and Hungary. And the fundamental problem of this statement is that the enlargement process can never resolve this. The enlargement process cannot provide guarantees that countries don't slide backwards on rule of law and democracy. And that is, you know, it's a statement of the obvious, which seems to be lost on many, that democracies, no matter how consolidated they are, can always deconsolidate. This is a two-way street, and if the United States of America can, in many ways, be deconsolidating democratic consensus, see the election of Supreme Court judges and other instruments which are fundamentally undermined the kind of what we consider to be a fully fledged democracy, then it can happen anywhere. And the hope that this can all be resolved in the accession process, and when the contract is signed and the country joins with fanfare and the European anthem, they're going to be forever consolidated democracies, is never going to work. There is no process in the world which can be strict enough to project a country's future 10 years down the road. When Hungary and Poland joined, everybody thought these are consolidated democracies which are stable, self-sustaining, and the success stories. Honestly, both countries are far away from being functional democracies at this particular point in time. They are not just illiberal democracies, they are not regular liberal democracies, and I don't mean liberal in the political sense, but in the sense of safeguarding checks and balances, rights of human rights, and so on. So I think what this debate actually should shift is, how do we make sure that the European Union can maintain these values and rule of law-based systems for member states? It cannot front-load it. It cannot. So in a certain way, the EU needs to reform the mechanisms of member states to be penalizing them in many ways, and we have to even, we have to include the option of losing member states if they move away too far from it, because if you are not basing your rule on rule of law and democracy, you should not be in the European Union. It's very simple. And countries like Hungary are moving quickly to a point where I, as a citizen of the European Union, am not comfortable with a country governed in that manner to be in the European Union, because it's based on common rules and it's a common understanding of protection of those rules. Now, this should not be the first resort, but there has to be an instrument, a whole set of instruments of how to deal with this. And that will make actually enlargement easier, because it reduces the pressure to resolve everything before accession. Countries can join, but there is always, and there should always be, a mechanism to make sure that rule of law is upheld. It's not going to be easy, and I'm fully aware of the shortcomings of implementing such a mechanism, but I think otherwise we have to be more combative in defending these liberal values. We have to be more straightforward and say we have to protect them in the interest of citizens of the European Union. This is not a matter of political debate. I was talking with a high-ranking Austrian official who said, well, we lead by example. We protect media freedom and civil society, and we hope to convince our Hungarian partners. Like, no, the Hungarian government does not want to do that. If you criminalize homelessness, if you criminalize higher education in many areas, independent academic research, media, you don't want to do it. You don't need the example to be inspired. You try to have a different example to inspire others. And we have to be very clear about that and not hope it's going to go away if we close our eyes and it's going to be just fine. No, it won't be. We have to be honest. We have to be straightforward. And the European Union is a community of law, of rules, and those rules are not drafted by dictators, but by democratic, inclusive processes. And if we stop fighting for that, then we might as well not fight for the European Union at all.
Thank you very much, Florian. Before we open the floor for the audience to pose your question, I would like to invite Mr. Ray to final this session.
Thank you for inviting me, Srđan, because I want to say that obviously I agree with Florian, and thank you for mentioning the rule of law and the importance of sticking to the democratic process. But I also want to say something about the enlargement and the meaning of the process and what the European Union is still able to deliver in terms of values. I would like to say that, I mean, look at this society now, you know, Serbia now. It's a flourishing civil society. There is an opportunity for minorities to have their own position in society. It might not be perfect, it's not perfect anywhere, but that definitely is something very important. And I think that, for instance, the fact that the European Union is a place where the civil society can really express itself at the most and in the best way, in any possible way, actually, I think it's the value that we should stick to the most, because it's the most important element of the dynamics internal to each population, and I think that this should be very clear in our mind. The issue of minority I want to mention because it's very important. I was speaking at Sant'Egidio event on Tuesday in Bologna, very important event with representatives of minorities from the Middle East and many persecuted areas where there are minorities persecuted. And I found myself saying that the way minorities are treated in a society has become a true indicator of the health of the democracy in that particular country. So all these elements make up the vision of the European Union, not only the rule of law, not only the markets, but also this flourishing society in which all parts are considered equal and have an equal say. And I think that this should be really something very important. And to conclude, I just want to say, I mean, yes, of course, there are disillusionments and perplexities, but Serbia in particular is EU-oriented, and we have to keep it EU-oriented. And we have the strength of being those who allow the process to become reality, and I think that this mutual looking at each other, if we want to use a metaphor, I think it's an important thing, because we are looking at each other in the eye, and I think that this is the best way of becoming true friends and becoming partners.
Thank you very much. Now the floor is open for your questions. Please present yourself briefly. We have 1, 2, and 3.
Brian Ebel from the Canadian Embassy. Thank you very much for this very interesting and wonderful discussion. There's been a lot of discussion in this panel about the aspirations. What should the European Union be? How can the European Union reinvent itself? My question is about what is in fact practically possible. Is there a possibility that the EU can reinvent itself, given that there are some member states in the EU who clearly have no political interest in seeing a more efficient, more effective European Union institutional structure, and clearly have no incentive whatsoever for their own political purposes to see a strengthening of a common European identity? Thank you.
Thomas, then we have a lady over there, and I saw 2 more hands, Naim and Kurt. Excuse me. Izvinite. Ovdje je Tomaš.
Hello, Tomasz Żarnaczuk from the Polish Institute of International Affairs based in Warsaw. Florian, thank you for your notes on Poland and Hungary, and I would like to ask you, because you're very much experienced with the enlargement process, can you see a clear link between what you call a declining democracy in Poland and Hungary and a deeper concern in the European Union elites about the enlargement to the Western Balkans? Thank you.
Lady over there.
Hello, everyone. I represent the United Nations in a way, but this is a personal question for today. My name is Vera, and I have an Irish passport and a Serbian passport, and both passports are hurting nowadays, one because it's not in the EU and the other because of Brexit. My question is, don't we need more politicians with the attitude of yes, we can in Europe today, instead of what Brian Cowen described once as things are bad and they're going to get worse, for which Brian Cowen was voted out of government and political life of Ireland in the next election round. Why? Because I think that Europe, in a state of introspection, as we said today, is wasting a lot of time for its people, because the issues it faces are not mythological, mythical creatures, unclear issues. The first crisis was related to the Greek debt. The second one is related to migration. These are clear-cut issues that need to be resolved, and I am not sure we need a reinvented EU to resolve them. So I'd like a take on that by everyone. Thanks a lot.
We will take 2 more questions and then we will have to close the floor. Kurt and Leo Naim is here.
Kurt Bessiner, Democratization Policy Council. This question is for Florian and Dr. KOVAL. I think what we're seeing in a lot of ways is the direction of travel of a lot of Balkan syndromes into the West. And you know, I call Trump our first Balkan president for a reason. The citizens and values elements that have come up in a number of presentations I think are important. I think Ukraine had a democratic breakthrough that was squandered after the Orange Revolution, in my opinion. And Macedonia had a democratic breakthrough in 2016, which may be in the process of being squandered now, we don't know. I wanted to ask you both, do you see lessons from the Western Balkans and Ukraine for democratic renewal within the European Union?
Thank you, Naim Leo, Institute for European Affairs. I do have a question for Ms. Del Rey. You mentioned several times European crisis, and do you think that the word crisis has been used quite too often recently? Because in my view, Europe has never been better than it is today. So do you believe that word crisis is being used too often? And just short question for Mr. BIEBER. You mentioned that EU is not a club that brings people or countries that are not ready. Do you think that European member states are communicating that well with Serbian and other leaderships in the region? And do you think that the European Union is left without carrots at this point? Thank you.
Okay. Ms. Del Rey?
Yes, obviously I will start from the end. Obviously each question would need another panel, but anyway, very quickly. I said that, I mentioned the word crisis, saying that I don't find it adequate, and I said, suggesting the word introspection instead. So this is to answer your question. I also agree with all the comments that have been made, that the European Union is there, is here actually, because I'm part of it, definitely, and it's there to stay. It's very solid power in the world, economic at all levels. Our reforms have been implemented. Obviously, it can be somehow improved in some aspects, and I think that the most important moment that we are, the most important element of the moment that we are living in this particular time, as Edvig Morvai was saying yesterday, is the awareness of the fact that we are going through a process that might change the European Union, and Serbia itself in 2025 might face a different feature in the European Union, because the European Union is changing. Changing is not something that we should fear. The problem is that we have to accept the debate. We have to be courageous enough and have a vision enough to accept the debate on certain issues. We have been used to a very opulent society where all the problems have been, so to speak, solved, where our societies are perfectly comfortable with their democracy, apart from cases in which there is a transition, let's say, which might be very critical, and we have to take it into consideration. But in general, there is a resistance to change, because we are very, let's say, somehow lazy in approaching new challenges. I think this is the moment in which we have to engage in a new debate for the best, to improve, but it needs courage and vision.
Thank you, Madam Del Rey. David, would you like to pick some of them?
I will pick, I think, 3 issues. The first is the role of the Western Balkans, or more generally the enlargement in what I would call EU identity. For us, clearly, the EU identity is also connected to how the EU could be perceived as the credible player by the outside world in the outside area. And for us, this area is basically the immediate neighborhood. It's East, it's Western Balkans, it's South. And in Western Balkans, we have the strongest instrument we have, and that's the enlargement. And through enlargement, we can basically achieve several goals. The first is that the enlargement is offer. We are not pushing anybody. We are not bullying anybody into anything. This is the honest offer, which comes at a price of really intensive, in-depth work of the partner if they would like to enter the European Union. So as such, if we are successful in the enlargement process in the Western Balkans, it will basically help us to increase our credibility, to stabilize our neighborhood, to make it more prosperous, to make it more peaceful, to bring it closer to our values. And the third, and that's the most important for us, to show the way how the international relations should look like. Basically based on offer and free will of the partners. And of course, and I would like to underline it, that requires the partners for very hard work and very hard activity. The second thing is the question on the reinventing the EU and whether certain things like migration could be done without the reinventing the EU. I would say absolutely. I think with migration, it's my sense that we are heading in the right direction. We don't need to reinvent the EU. We just need to reach the level of consensus which will be detailed enough to find the workable solutions. And I think this is also the answer to many issues we have just discussed here. And I personally experienced that in the negotiations, in many negotiations which I was part of, the level of consensus is basically key to implementing decision. If I agree with you that, for example, the EU is a good thing, it may not be enough for me to say that you should be part of the EU. So the level of the detail of the consensus is the most critical thing, and I agree that this level of the detail is basically done through the very honest dialogue and reflection of each other's priorities. And the last, and this is what I started with the first, we are sitting in the Western Balkans, and I really don't want to project very pessimistic view of the EU. What's the state of the EU, that we are at the decline? I think the EU is still for many countries, the role model. We tend to be very critical about ourselves, and there are points to, there are reasons why we should be critical and to find the ways, but we still are by far the most successful historic project. So it's in our interest, and that's the answer to the question, to the first question, which was which purported that there might be countries in the EU which don't want the EU to be more efficient, more effective. I have never witnessed any such country which wants to remain in the EU, of course. What I witnessed was this level of the detail which was not good enough to say, okay, we will go this or that direction, because the solution for these very things could be different. There is not the only solution. There are more solutions to be found, and what we need is the level of the detail which allows us to go forward in the concrete terms. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Guillaume, do we have yes we can politicians in Europe?
Maybe we should have, at least. Maybe we should have. But I think maybe 3 remarks. First of all, what is the DNA of Europe? And I fully agree with David. The DNA of Europe is both innovation and self-critical thinking. And self-critical thinking is something very positive, which is perceived negatively. So it's a paradox. But it's part of our way of being. And we have a second asset, which is very valuable if we can discuss, we can debate, we can disagree, but at the end of the day, we find a shared solution. It can take time, but we do it. And this is the European, the EU miracle, this capacity to go ahead and to find decision. First point. Second point about vision. And then leadership and the fact that we need to have yes, we can man. First of all, I would say we would need an Erasmus for political leaders. Because if you are not able to be in the situation of your neighbor, you can't develop a shared vision. And the real issue with the EU is you don't need to think only on the interest of your country, but you need to imagine the shared interest of the European citizen and see how to combine them. So a good compromise is a compromise where nobody is satisfied. If somebody is satisfied, it means that there is a disbalance, and this is a bad compromise. But the right thing is, you spoke earlier about the report that we made for Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk, the European way for a better future. This report was a kind of high-level consensus by leaders and thinkers of all the EU, of all sensitivities. So we have on the table a positive document. Macron took a big part of it in the speech for the future of the his Sorbonne speech on the future of the EU. It was taken in the agreement between SPD and CDU. I think the real topic is civil society need to organize to put pressure on politicians. When we saw Merkel, Hollande, etc., just during the Brexit crisis at the beginning, they told us we need to have a transnational citizen push, because otherwise we are not able to decide together. We need to have a European public opinion to go ahead together. And the last point about concrete things. We have a multi-annual framework, the budget of the EU. And in fact, this budget is a way to find compromise between ourselves and to commit ourselves. Because Italy, even Poland and Hungary have some practical interest. And they are going to discuss and to compromise and to, in fact, de facto, to commit on our own map. So the question is, are we going to be able to have a qualitative roadmap or not in terms of budget? And we have key steps. We have this council discussion. We will have the European election. And last point. For me, there is one critical country for the future of Europe, which is Poland. Because Poland wants to play a much bigger role, and they would like to be much more included in what we call the moteur franco-allemand, or the Franco-German partnership. And if they find the role to shape the future of Europe positively, we will have another dynamic within the EU. Because civil society, even if it was not what it was in Poland, remains very strong. You have media pluralism with good newspaper, I think about Gazeta, etc. You have an ecosystem which is much more strong, a democratic ecosystem which is much more stronger than in Hungary. And I believe this ecosystem will survive to the present government. And my conclusion is we need to have political leaders who think as citizens and citizens who act as political leaders.
Nadiia, your closing remarks and some answers to the questions.
I will just try to do it quickly. Answering to the remarks about democratic transformation in Ukraine, I think the main idea would be, again, for the European Union to see that it is still a huge transformative power, even if it does not put too much effort in it. It's still a very powerful idea which not only produces some romantic visions, it produces a very concrete work, even if your country does not have, as the present in large accession perspective, a hard work of reform. And this is very important, especially if we look at our eastern neighbor. We don't have such kind of attraction from Russia. We do not have this huge movements of population. Let's emulate Russia. Let's join this integration path. Now it's like less than 10% of Ukrainian citizens would like to go that way. And this is most striking as there is so many like historical and cultural connections, but it is just not attractive. And European Union should not underestimate its attraction and transformative power, which is real, which is on the ground, which changes states here and now. And probably sometimes our ideas about Europe are more idealistic than it is, but I think it can be overcome. And just a short reflection, if some problems of the European Union can be just resolved with the current institutional structure, I think we are some courage to understand that sometimes you have to make decisions. Sometimes you can't just hope that you stay on this level and we somehow find solutions. Sometimes to find solution you need to go through very, very deep changes and to pay some price, and it's also the lesson that we have learned on our experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadiia. And Florian, you have the honor to close the session.
It's a dubious honor, and I will be brief. The first point is, what are the Balkan lessons or lesson of transformation for the European Union in terms of dealing with undemocratic tendencies? And I think many of the autocrats today govern through polarization, and the only way to fight that is to try to create a majority against that and basically not play on their terms, because they try to find new issues, whether it is migration, whether it is other issues, and one has to in a certain way challenge that narrative and say fighting the debates on different grounds, mostly in questions of democracy and of also corruption, to kind of challenge them, because every autocrat is not just a populist or uses populism, but it's he is also a crook for the most part. So that's, I think, the main lesson. The question about the reform of the European Union itself, I think the European Union itself has never been good at big bang reforms. It's been very good at gradual evolution, and I think this is not going to change. It's a structural nature of the EU that it's an evolving rather than a transformative and a dramatic gesture kind of institution. And I think that's some of its benefits, that it tweaks, it learns, it's a very, in a certain way, organic process of change. And I think we should think about these mechanisms which might work there, but they're not going to be rethinking the Union as a fundamentally different creature, but rather as how to make it work better. The link between Poland and to the question Hungary and the democratic decline towards skepticism to the enlargement, I think it's part of the larger package. If you look at the countries which are skeptical about enlargement, France, the Netherlands, it's very often the argument is exactly given. Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland is the four names you get when you ask that question. And I think unfairly or fairly, this is the reality. And the last sentence I would like to make is, you know, as a scholar of Yugoslavian history as well, there's this paradox. When Yugoslavia was moving towards disintegration, it had the highest number of self-identified Yugoslavs, right? So I want Europe to avoid the Yugoslav trap. I mean, I'm aware of many differences of having a continent with many Europeans and politicians which destroy deliberately sometimes this texture because of own national interests. And I think it reinforces Guillaume's point that we have to find points where national silos are disrupted. Yugoslavia fell apart for many reasons, but one of them was there was no space for a Yugoslav politician. You were a Serb, a Croat, a Slovene, Macedonian politician, and Yugoslav second. And we need in a certain way European politicians who are able to run as Europeans and make European politics. Doesn't mean that that there are no German and French and other politicians, but we need this, which creates an incentive for kind of joint projects. And you know, this is not going to happen tomorrow, but there are small steps which we should think about of how to create people who are elected and supported across Europe and not just secondary Europeans, so to speak.
Thank you very much. With this, we have exhausted our agenda. I would like to thank all the panelists for their excellent contributions. At the end of this session, I would just like to mention one thing, and this is that whenever there is an integrative process ongoing among the countries in international relations, there are a couple of elements which are crucial. One is a common interest, and I think that we can conclude today that there is a common interest between all the EU 27, 28 plus Western Balkans, that the destiny of Europe belongs to us, the future belongs to us, and that there is a tangible future for everybody in a joint integration. The second element is the compatibility of elites, and obviously this is something that needs to be further explored. And the third element is the importance of the values around which an integration takes place. This is something that cannot be ticked as a sort of a technical exercise, but this is what we need to feel, like you, Madame Del Rey, said. You need to internalize the principles on which the EU has been founded, and then practice it in your everyday life. Once again, I would like to thank BSF, and I would like to thank European Fund for the Balkans for enabling this panel, and I would like to kindly ask you to join me in congratulating the panelists on an excellent panel. Thank you very much.